Hi, my name is Tim Gifford, and I get to read the passage for our sermon today. It's found in John 19, verses 1 through 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." From the moment Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard the words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar." The chief priests answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified.
Thanks, Tim. Well, good morning. It's great to be with you today. My name is Brian. I'm one of the pastors here at GBC. If you're new with us, I'd love the chance to meet you. I'm down front every Sunday, and I'd love for you to stop me at some point and just say hello. Love to learn your name, find out what brought you here, how we can serve you as a church. And we've been in this series for a little while now where we've been talking about what it means for Jesus to be our King and how we should live for his kingdom in the world in light of that. And we started this series by talking about how we really don't like the idea of a king for multiple different reasons. And one of those reasons was that we've never seen a perfect king. In fact, it's been very rare that we've even seen a good king. Most kings throughout human history have been pretty terrible. And because of that, we're skittish of the idea of anyone being a king, especially someone having as much power as Jesus, when we say that he's just the king of everything, of the entire universe. But I'm convinced that if we spent as much time as we could looking at the nature of who Jesus is as our king, we'd be less worried about him holding that kind of role. And so today, depending on your background, it's likely that you're not going to hear anything new. In fact, it's probably going to be a lot of stuff that you've heard before, but what I've experienced in my life recently is that you don't need to experience something new in order to appreciate it or find its beauty all over again in your life. So my wife and I have lived here for a little over 4 years now, and we realized recently that in that entire time, we had never been at Lake Michigan for a sunset. And so we decided to fix that, and we got our kids together. We went down to Lake Michigan to watch the sunset, and it was awesome. It was breathtaking. The colors were amazing. I was shocked at how much light was still left after the sun dipped below the water. It was an awesome experience, but what I know is that one time of being there for the sunset, I didn't experience all that I could with it. And I know that because I've had a couple people ask me since then, "Oh, did you notice this about the sunset?" And I didn't notice it. So I know that I'm going to get to go down there and experience that sunset all over again and have just as much of a breathtaking, awe-inspiring moment. And this happens with my wife, actually, where I will find myself just staring at her in a way that would be creepy if she wasn't my wife. In fact, it might still be creepy, even though she is my wife. I'm going to have to ask her that a little bit later on today. But I'll just find myself staring at her because I'm just captivated. I'm just caught up in how beautiful she is, how much I appreciate her, and what she does for our family. And her and I have been romantically attached in some way in our lives for over 20 years. And the same is true when it comes to Jesus. I'm completely convinced that you and I could stare at Jesus 9 billion times for thousands of hours and still be captivated by his beauty and his goodness, and still appreciate something different about him. And I'm not trying to be dramatic there. I'm convinced that for all of eternity, you and I will gaze upon Jesus and we will be blown away by him over and over and over again. And so that's what I want to do with our time together today. I want us to look at the text that Tim read for us, and I want us to see three things about Jesus. I want us to see that he's the perfect human being, the divine Son of God, and the suffering servant. Jesus is the perfect human, the divine Son, and the suffering servant. The trial of Jesus that we're reading here, the record of it, is given to us by one of his closest friends and followers by the name of John. And at this point in Jesus' trial, he's already been convicted by the religious leaders of his people of blasphemy, and they want Jesus to be killed for that. And so the Jewish religious leaders bring Jesus to a Roman governor named Pilate, who begins his questioning of Jesus, and after he questions him, he doesn't have anything to charge Jesus for. And so we'll look at verses 1 through 3 here in a minute. We'll get back to the flogging. But what I want to do is I want you to see verses 4 through 6. Look at this interaction between Pilate and the religious leaders. It starts, Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." I just want you to see the injustice that is all over this trial of Jesus. This isn't the first time that Pilate has declared his innocence. If you go back to verse 38 of chapter 18, Pilate says there, I have no reason to charge this man, but he has Jesus flogged anyway. He has a completely innocent man beaten because Pilate doesn't care about justice. He just wants to get Jesus out of his hair. And so having Jesus beaten, he brings him out in verse 4, and he says, he's innocent, I can't charge him. And the people start yelling at him to crucify him even more. And then Pilate comes back in verse 6, and he says, listen, I've got nothing. There's nothing that I can charge him for him to be executed. In fact, there's nothing that I can charge him for at all. And what the author is trying to get across to us here is that Pilate is declaring for us that Jesus was the perfect human being. That Jesus never did anything wrong, that throughout his entire life, there was nothing in Jesus that he ever did or said or thought that was sinful, that had malice in it, hatred, oppression, injustice. Jesus lived a completely perfect life. Like if you went over all of Jesus' life with a fine-tooth comb, you would never find anything he did or said or even thought that would be worthy of any kind of accusation. That's insane to think about, isn't it? I don't know about you, but there are days where I don't even get through breakfast with that kind of track record. And yet for every second of Jesus' life, he was the definition of perfect. And what's so beautiful about that is that when we see that in Jesus, we see what we were as human beings were created to be. This is what's happening in a phrase in verse 5 that I think is so deep that you could literally meditate on it for just hours, where Pilate brings Jesus out before the people, and in verse 5 he says, "Here is the man." Another way that you could translate that would be to say, "Look at the man," or "Behold the man." And what's happening here is that Pilate, probably quite unintentionally, is giving Jesus a title. And in the divinely inspired author showing us what Pilate is doing here, he's trying to tie Jesus to the first man that God created, a man by the name of Adam. In fact, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Scriptures, in the first portion called the Old Testament, in a writing called Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, you'll find this. The Lord God said, "Since the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, he must not reach out, take from the tree of life, eat, and live forever." Now, the context of this verse is that God has created humanity for the purpose of dwelling with him in intimate relationship and ruling over creation on his behalf. And God takes the first two people named Adam and Eve, he puts them in a garden, and he gives them one command to follow. And Adam and Eve rebel against that one command. They refuse to do it. And so God, in his grace and mercy towards them, alienates them. He exiles them from the garden. Did you notice that the title that God uses here in Genesis 3:22? He says, "the man." Not a man, not some man, but the man, Adam. This is why Pilate saying, "Behold the man," in John 19, verse 5, is so important, because in Genesis 3:22, this title declares that humanity is now in a state that is separated from God, that is in a state of depravity that results in death. Like, it declares man's guilt for not being everything that God created us to be. But then in Jesus here, this title declares the opposite. It's the announcement of the reversal of the state of death and depravity that's going to happen in Jesus when he takes all of that death, all of that depravity, and that status of guilt on himself so that he can liberate us from sin and death by rising from the dead. I love how Clinton Arnold puts it when he says this: on the surface, Jesus was presented to the world as a broken individual, weakened and unable to avoid his impending death. But in reality, Jesus was standing before God as the representative of the world, broken by the world's sinful condition that he embraced willingly and without sinning himself, so as to take in his body their impending death. Jesus was everything that humanity was supposed to be so that we could be freed to be everything that God made us to be. Jesus was the perfect human being. Now, here's what that means for us. When you think of the perfect human being, what do you think of? When you think of what embodies everything good about what it means to be human, what do you think of? Who do you think of? Because what's important to realize is that all of us are trying to put together the pieces of that puzzle. We all have ideas about what it means for human beings to flourish. Well, what does it mean for us to live as individuals and cultivate our own lives while also being in community with other people? And there are lots of ideas out there about that, especially in our current moment. Like, conservatives have ideas about that. Progressives have ideas about independent. Like, you name it, everybody's got ideas about that. But the question we have to ask is, what's the picture that we're using to put together the puzzle? Because the nature of a puzzle is it's not something that we create. It's something that's been made for us and that we put together. And what makes the process of putting a puzzle together easier is when you have the picture, the end result of what it's supposed to be look like. So my grandma loves putting together puzzles. She will do these puzzles that are like thousands of pieces, and she's gotten so good at it that she will try to make it more difficult for herself, where she will take these puzzles of thousands of pieces, dump them on her puzzle table, and then put the box away and try to put it together without the picture. I couldn't do that with a 100-piece puzzle, and yet she tries to do this with puzzles that are thousands of pieces. But I could always tell when my grandma had come across a puzzle that was a little more difficult than what she was used to, because I would walk into her house, and on her table with those thousands of pieces would be the cover of the box, would be the picture that she was using. And what this text is telling us is that when we're trying to figure out how to put together the puzzle of what it means to be human, Jesus is on the cover of the box. He's the one that we're supposed to look at to put that puzzle together. So what that means for you, really practically, is that if you want to know what it means to be human, you look to Jesus. You behold the man that is Jesus. So, do you want to know what you should be like as a parent? Then you look to Jesus. I know he didn't have kids, but if he's the perfect human being, then you look at who Jesus was and you apply that to all you do as a parent. Same thing with marriage. Like, you want to know what you're supposed to be like as a spouse? You look to Jesus. You want to know what anything else too. You want to know what you're supposed to be like as a boss, an employee, a friend, a child, whatever, you name it. You look to Jesus. And it's not just what you're supposed to be with different roles in your life. You can ask that about anything that we do in the human life. Like, you want to know what we're supposed to do with things like power or control or money. You look to Jesus. You behold the man over and over again as he's revealed himself to you in his word, so that we can be transformed more and more into the picture of what God has for us as humanity. We can see something similar in the fact that Jesus isn't just the perfect human being, he's also the divine Son. Look back with me at verses 7 and 8. It says, "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. Pilate's being confronted here for the first time with the fact that Jesus might be someone a little bit greater than he thought he was. The Jews at the time, the reason they're so scandalized about Jesus, one of them is that the Jews are monotheists. They only believe in one God, and they believe that if anyone who's a human being desires to be worshipped or put on the same level as God, that's blasphemous. It's one of the worst things that you can do. And so because of that, especially in Jesus' day, the Jewish people believed that if anyone tried to do that, they should be treated extremely harshly. They should be put to death. And so they bring Jesus to Pilate, like they finally give Pilate the reason why they supposedly brought him, and that is that he's blasphemed. He's made himself out to be God. The thing is, though, they've brought him to a Roman governor. And so for Pilate, as a Roman, he's not a monotheist, he's a polytheist. He would have believed in multiple gods that were worthy of worship, and he also would have believed in something called demigods. Demigods were believed to be children who resulted from humans and gods getting together, and they were extremely powerful. And so when Pilate hears that Jesus has claimed himself to be the Son of God, he's terrified. He's more afraid now than he ever has been because he wonders whether or not he's dealing with one of these demigods. In fact, he's probably wondering whether or not Jesus might actually be a god, because in Greco-Roman religion, the gods were able to walk around among human beings. You can tell that this is what's going on in Pilate's mind, because the question he asks Jesus is, "Where are you from?" Like, he's not looking for Jesus' address here. He's asking him, are you from the heavens? Are you one of the gods? Or are you just a human being like us? And Jesus refuses to answer, and I think that Pilate goes into panic mode because you see him power up. Like, he makes a power play. He looks at Jesus. "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize that I'm the one who decides today whether you go free or you're crucified?" You hear what Pilate is doing? I don't care whether you're a god, a demigod, or just another human being. I'm the one with the power. I'm the one who's in control. I decide whether you live or you die today. Look at how Jesus responds. "You would have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Jesus reminds Pilate that Pilate has no authority other than what's been given to him. Pilate does have authority. Jesus isn't saying that, but what he's saying is, Pilate, the only authority that you have is the authority that's been given you from above. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, Pilate, the only authority you have is the authority that I've given to you. He's claiming to Pilate here the same thing that he did to the Jews, and that he is God. That he is the divine Son of God. He's co-equal with God, like he's the king of the universe. There was a common practice in the Roman Empire where they would make statues of the current Caesar, the current emperor, whoever was in power. And we know this because you can go to museums all over the world and look at these statues. And when we do that, we look at them and we think, oh, this must have been what Emperor Claudius or Nero or whoever looked like. But what's fascinating, if you do the research about those statues, is that none of them were found in Rome. Because you didn't need a statue in Rome. Caesar lived in Rome. So people who lived in Rome saw Caesar. They knew what he looked like. Where those statues are found are in places like modern-day France, modern-day Turkey, Egypt. Because what the Romans would do is make statues of Caesar all over the empire where people would never see him as a reminder to say, this is the one who rules. This is the one who's in charge. This is the one who brought us peace and prosperity, and this is the one to whom our allegiance belongs. And that's what Jesus is claiming to be. He's claiming to be the true image of God, the one who has brought God's wisdom into the world. He's the one who's made the invisible God visible. He is the living, breathing statue of the emperor of the universe who has been placed in our world to show us exactly who our true master is. This is why you and I don't just behold Jesus to figure out who we should be as human beings. We behold him to figure out who God is. Like if you're at a point in your life where you're trying to put together the puzzle of who God is, you look to Jesus to do that. Because here's the claim that's being made by John in this recording of events. The claim that's being made is that when you and I try to put together the pieces of the puzzle of what it means to be human or who God is, Jesus is on the cover of both of those boxes. That's a scandalous claim. It's such a scandalous claim that's been causing problems for people ever since these events that are recorded for us here actually happened. You mean to tell me that all that is good and right and beautiful about human beings and about God is wrapped up in a single person? Like some guy named Jesus who lived in Israel in the 1st century AD? It's a bold claim, and one that should either be accepted or rejected with the same level of boldness. This is what's behind Jesus' claim about the greater sin here. Pilate certainly has sinned. Jesus isn't letting Pilate off the hook in any way, shape, or form. But Jesus says that the one who has the greater sin is the high priest, the representative of the powers of Jerusalem, who's handed Jesus over to Pilate. But what sin is he talking about? What's the sin that's involved here? And you see it in verse 15. They shouted, take him away, crucify him. Pilate said to them, should I crucify your king? Listen to this. We have no king but Caesar. If you were to sit down and you were to read the Bible from cover to cover, and you were to track with what's going on, you would realize that those last words in verse 15 are some of the most shocking in all of the Scriptures. Because these are the religious leaders of God's chosen people whose scriptures they teach on a regular basis are constantly claiming over and over again that the only king is God. That the only king is Yahweh, and that all earthly kings are a sham, a fake compared to the true king. The cry of the Old Testament is that there is no king but Yahweh. And here, the religious leaders of God's people cry out, there is no king but Caesar. They're so scandalized and threatened by Jesus that they not only reject him, but they reject God as their king. They commit the blasphemy that they're accusing Jesus of committing. Like the rejection of the innocent Jesus here shows us the depth of our sinfulness as humanity. That comes out in refusing to acknowledge Jesus for who he is. And I just want you to know that all of us have participated in that. Every single one of us have looked at God, looked at Jesus as the rightful king of the universe, and responded by saying, there is no king other than that of our own making. I'm telling you, the vast majority of us, if not all of us, if we would have been there that day, would have been shouting, crucify him, along with everyone else. What would you do in that situation if you were Jesus? If you were the perfect human being, the divine Son of God, and had all of the power that came with that identity, what would you do? I'll tell you, if it were me, I'd be tempted to melt everyone who was standing there. At the very least, I would do something to show them that you don't treat someone like me that way. And thankfully, Jesus responds nothing like I would. Because it's in this moment where he shows us that he's not just the perfect human being or the divine Son of God, he's also the suffering servant. Let's rewind to verses 1 through 3, because the irony in these verses is just thick. Let's read them again together. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him and saying, Hail, King of the Jews. and were slapping his face. Now, this flogging that Jesus faced here was a common punishment in both the Jewish and Greco-Roman world. And what would happen is the person would be stripped naked, and they would be tied to, their hands would be tied to some kind of a pole if it was there. If not, they'd just be thrown on the ground naked, and then they would be whipped with a device that was made of leather straps that had pieces of metal or bone or stone woven into them, so that when you were whipped with it and it was pulled back, it would rip the skin off of your back, blow by blow by blow. And that wasn't enough for these Roman soldiers, by the way. After they were done with that, they stand up Jesus' naked and bleeding body, and they put a purple robe on him, which was the color of royalty in his day, and they mash a crown of thorns on his head. This is a satire. Like they're making a comedy out of an actual coronation ceremony. And if all of that wasn't enough, it's likely that man for man, every single Roman soldier involved would have walked up to Jesus, looked him in the face, and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and then slapped him with everything that they had. They're treating Jesus like a plaything. They're making him out to be a clown rather than a king. Again, what would you do if you were Jesus? Because the irony of all of this is that in the soldiers' attempts to brutalize Jesus, mock him, and shame him, they're actually declaring exactly who he is. They're showing us that the King of the universe is also the suffering servant, someone who brings peace without the sword, someone who doesn't need to fight in order to ensure his eternal reign. You can really see this in Jesus' arrest that precedes this trial, and Jesus alludes to it in John 18:36. Let me read that verse for you. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." What's really interesting about that verse is that Jesus claims in the middle that if my kingdom were from this world, my servants would fight to make sure I didn't get handed over. They tried to. They tried to fight for Jesus. You can see this because earlier in John chapter 8, when Jesus is being arrested, here's what happens in verses 10 and 11. "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. At that, Jesus said to Peter, 'Put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?'" Jesus' followers didn't willingly allow him to be arrested. They wanted to fight, so much so that one of his most passionate followers and friend named Peter pulls his sword out, and you got to realize he's trying to cut the guy's head off. He just missed and cut off his ear instead. And Jesus looks at him and he says, "Put the sword away. My kingdom's not from this world." Peter looks like the strong one, but he's really weak and impulsive. Jesus looks like the weak one, but he's the strong one because he's proving that it takes more strength not to pull your sword and wield it than it often does to do so. This teaching is showing us something that's so important for any of us who want to follow after Jesus. In fact, it's just showing us something so important for life in general, and that is the way up is down. Jesus' kingdom is one that has totally different values and evaluations than the kingdoms of our world. He's showing us that to follow after him means that we choose to do things differently. And what I want to do is I want to name some of those things for you that we see in our passage alone, where to follow after the suffering servant king, Jesus, means that we choose humility over pride. Like the whole time that Jesus is on trial here, you notice that he never rolls out his resume. Like, where am I from? I'm from the presence of God himself. And I'm coming from the presence of God himself as God himself. You want to know who I am? I'm the God of gods. I'm the King of kings. I'm the Lord of lords. Jesus never does it. He never rolls out his resume the way that I want to whenever anyone looks at me and asks me, who do I think that I am? He exemplifies a humility that in that moment refuses to flaunt his divine sonship or his perfect humanity. He also chooses forgiveness over vengeance. Never once throughout his trial and his death does Jesus make anyone pay for anything that they're doing to him. Not only that, he takes it up another level where not only does he not take vengeance, he doesn't wish or desire harm on the people who are doing those things to him. He simply takes all that they're doing to him on himself so that he can die and pay for it. And you can see that that's true because when you read Luke's account of Jesus' death, he tells us that while Jesus is on the cross, he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." He chooses sacrifice over self-benefit. Jesus knows that if he allows what's happening to him to continue, it's going to cause him to face the kind of suffering that you and I cannot possibly imagine, and yet he willingly does it. He sacrifices what would be in his best interest and his best desires for our needs and what's in our best interest and what we need most in him dying for our sin. He puts our needs and what's best for us ahead of himself. And lastly, he chooses self-control over exploitation. What I mean by that is that Jesus never exploits the power that he has as the perfect human being and the divine Son of God in order to better himself. This is really brought home in Matthew's account of Jesus' arrest that we looked at a minute ago, where it says that when Peter missed and cut the guy's ear off, that Jesus responded by looking at Peter and saying, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father and he'll provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels?" Everything that is happening to Jesus in this moment, he's allowing to happen. And rather than exploit the power that he has to better himself, he denies himself that right and that ability. The values of Jesus' kingdom are radically different than the values of the world, which are exemplified by Pilate, the religious leaders, and the soldiers. Like you can just see it all over them. They're all about pride. They're all about the status that they've achieved in their world as religious leaders and as the governor and as soldiers. And you can see that because they use all of their power. They exploit it as much as they can for their own benefit at the expense of others, especially Jesus, who they're all taking vengeance on because he's a threat to that status and that power that they love so much. These are the choices that are placed before us today. There is Jesus' kingdom and there is Jesus' way, or there is the world's kingdom and the world's way. And so just to show you the result of adopting that mentality that the way up is actually down, I want you to see what happens to Jesus because of his willingness to do everything that we've talked about. Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, it says this. It says, "For this reason," because of everything that we've been talking about, because of Jesus' willingness to go through all that he did, to die on a cross and to rise again for the forgiveness of our sins, for this reason, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every other name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee in heaven and on earth and under the earth would bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of God the Father. The way up was down for Jesus. And one day, those soldiers who did all of those things we talked about to Jesus are going to reenact that coronation. Only they're going to do so with a different intention and a different mentality entirely when they bow their knee to Jesus as the King, as the Lord that he actually is. If you and I want to live a life that is truly the way that it's meant to be, then we have to use Jesus as the picture of how we do it. And here, look, I just want, this is the picture. This is the picture. It's the bread and the cup that symbolize the willingness of the perfect human being and divine Son of God to suffer as our servant by allowing his body to be broken and his blood to be shed. Can I ask you this morning, what picture are you using to put together the pieces of your life? Are you using the picture that's given to us by the kingdoms and the rulers of our world, or are you using the picture that Jesus has given to us, symbolized in these elements that we are about to take? Do you embody the values of Jesus and his kingdom, or the values of our world's kingdom? Ask yourself that. Jesus, we declare this morning that we look to you as the perfect human being, as the one who modeled and lived out for us perfectly everything that we were meant to be as your image. We also declare this morning that you are the divine Son, that you have made the invisible triune God of the universe visible among us, so that we could have a deep, intimate relationship with you that knows you on a level we'd be incapable of on our own. We look to you today as the suffering servant who took all of that perfection and all of that divinity to a cross on our behalf, so that you could suffer in our place, so that we would never have to face the consequences for our rebellion against you if we would simply give you our lives, give you our loyalty and our allegiance and our following. Because of those things, I pray that you would help us to be captivated by you on a regular basis. Help us to behold you in every area of our lives. I pray that you would work in our hearts to show us areas where we are not embodying your kingdom and your values, but instead embodying the kingdom and the values of our world. Would you work in each of our hearts the way that we need it, to draw us closer to you, to have a closer and deeper and more intimate realization of the nature of who you are, so that we can embrace you as our King even more in our lives. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.